So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Navigating Solar Leases for Wisconsin Landowners. I'm here as Jessie Bradish, a renewable energy specialist for UW-Madison's Division of Extension. And I work on RESET, which stands for Renewable Energy Siting and Engagement for Tomorrow. And RESET is supported by a U.S. Department of Energy Office grant through the RSTEP program. RESET helps Wisconsin communities get ready before big wind or solar energy projects come to their communities. Right now, these large renewable energy projects are being built across Wisconsin with more to come. And when developers arrive and there's no clear community plan, things don't always go smoothly. So that's why planning early is key. And RESET gives communities the tools and support they need to talk through what matters most. What do you want? What do you not want? And RESET has the resources to support local governments and communities on topics including solar land leasing contracts, which we'll be hearing more about today. In addition, we discuss how to understand the siting process for large-scale projects of any size, how to participate in public hearings and comment periods with the Public Service Commission, how to identify your community's priorities so that you can then document them, for example, through a solar ordinance or by updating your comprehensive plan. And we also discuss how to negotiate additional contracts with developers. So today we are excited to have Bill Omican and Kelly Wilfert here to share more information about solar land leasing in Wisconsin. Bill is Extension's law professor and Kelly is Extension's farm law outreach specialist. They wrote this document together to give landowners guidance on the things to consider before you sign on the dotted line. So thank you both so much for being here, and I'll pass it over to you to begin the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jessie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully everyone can see the presentation. Great.
Yes,
and as Jessie said, I'm what we call a professor of practice in law here at UW-Madison Extension. I have a pretty lengthy career in agriculture and agricultural contracts. Among other things, I used to be head of consumer protection for the state of Wisconsin at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. And I think during the 6 years that I was head of that program, my staff and I must have reviewed over 20,000 contracts. And our role was to determine whether or not there were misrepresentations made in the types of marketing that was occurring, and whether those misrepresentations went through the contracts and whether contracts were being appropriately applied or not. So pretty extensive background in this area. Kelly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Jessie, for the introduction. As they both said, my name is Kelly Wilfert. I work in the farm management program here at Extension as the farm law outreach specialist. So like Bill, I'm also an attorney that primarily practiced in the transactional space. So I think Bill has some experience both transactional and litigation. I've leaned a little bit heavier into transactional. But in this particular role, I really work closely with farmers and landowners for issues that they're facing. So on the solar lease side of things, my background was a little bit more focused on negotiating those when I was in private practice. For farmers who were trying to think about what's unique about my land, what's unique about trying to lease something that's currently in ag production, and what does this look like in the future. So Bill and I love tag teaming these presentations. Yeah. So he's going to take the lead today, and then I will pop in as things come up. There are lots of facets to this conversation, and we'll try to hit as many of them as we can.
And the other thing, I'll just note that both Kelly and I are farm kids. And so we grew up in agriculture. We've stayed in agriculture despite being attorneys. And just throw that out there. And then I will say, if you do have questions, we certainly welcome those questions. Please put them in the chat feature, and Jessie and Katie will be monitoring those. Kelly and I will be too. And sometimes when you're speaking, it's kind of hard to monitor the chat function, but we welcome the questions, and we definitely will leave time towards the end. We'll probably wait on answering most of the questions at the end, just so we can get through the presentation. So with that, hopefully I'm able to move to the next slide. And because Kelly and I are both attorneys, we're required to do a disclaimer since we're both attorneys here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I know you can all read, but essentially we're not providing you with one-on-one legal advice. That you need to consult with a competent legal counsel if you're reviewing a contract for a solar lease and before you sign that contract for a solar lease. And so there's no attorney-client relationship between you and us and or with the university. And sorry we have to do this disclaimer right up front, but this is required. Again, please seek assistance from your own legal counsel. And I will just note as an aside that the Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation has prepared a list of attorneys, which is available on their website. And you can also get that list from Kelly and from me, but attorneys who have practice in this area. And so when you consult with them, they're not going to have to suddenly learn about solar and contracts. They already have that knowledge base. So with that, we'll move to where we're going to go with this presentation. We'll start off by talking about what solar developers are really seeking. So if you've been approached by a solar developer, this might help you figure out why they're looking at leasing your land. We'll talk about considerations that you should think about before contracting as a landowner. What could be the potential implications from a property tax perspective, lease location considerations, farmland preservation implications. Once again, I know everyone can read here, but just to set this up for those who will be watching later on the video, agreement term, termination and confidentiality, payment terms and insurance, signing bonus and attorney's fees. If you don't already have the feeling, there are a lot of different aspects to these agreements. And then we'll talk about the guide for leasing land for solar development. We've published a very extensive guide that will help you, and it's available at no cost. We'll provide the link on our website, but you can use this as a base document for figuring out what do I really need to think about if I've been approached by a solar developer. Then we also have created a worksheet which includes all of the primary questions that you should be thinking about, that you should try to get answers before you go in and see your attorney so that your attorney has the context by which they're evaluating the agreement. But having said that, don't feel badly if you don't have all that answered before you see your attorney. That's part of the role of your attorney to make sure that you have full information. And then we'll finish with resources, acknowledgments, and any questions that you might have. So let's talk about what solar developers are really looking for. As Jesse said, solar is becoming a really significant part of the energy mix here in the state of Wisconsin. And solar developers, that could be your large utilities whose names you know, We Energies, Excel, and others, are looking for land, but they're typically looking for large amounts of land and for 100 megawatts or larger projects. What we're really addressing are the projects that are smaller, typically 1 to 2, maybe a few more megawatts. And what the developers are looking for is land that's located near roads. It's free of trees, buildings, and other obstructions to sunlight. They are looking for land that's located near power transmission facilities, so three-phase hubs, power substations. And the closer you are to the substations, generally, the more likely the developer is going to offer more money. So going back up to the top bullet, what are we typically seeing? We're seeing anywhere between $500 to $2,500 per acre, and that's per year, that's being offered by solar developers. We'll talk a little bit later about really there's 3 stages of how that money is contracted. Because there's an initial, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but there's an initial phase, then there's a middle phase, and then there's finally a post-construction where they're actually generating energy. And finally, they're also looking for communities where there is little or no political opposition. Solar has proven to be controversial in certain areas of the state. I'm officed here in Dodgeville at the courthouse, Iowa County Courthouse, and there has been controversy in this area. There's controversy in other areas. So solar developers are looking for places where they're going to come in and be welcomed, not necessarily face a lot of hostility right from the start. So looking at and I'm just opening up another thing, but landowner considerations before contracting, these are things you should think about as you're looking at the potential for engaging in a solar lease. And first of all, realize that the solar lease has been developed by attorneys for the solar developer. And so that's one of the reasons why you want to be very cautious about signing. If a solar developer shows up in your farm lane and says that we'd like to talk to you about leasing your land. And if you sign today, we're going to offer you a significant monetary bonus. This is my opinion, not necessarily the University of Wisconsin-Madison Board of Regents' opinion, but as the former head of consumer protection for the state, that's usually a red flag warning that you should say, not that fast. We're going to review this with our attorney. We'll get back to you. And if they're not interested after that first 24 hours, then they were trying at what we call a high pressure sales tactics. But the reason why they might try that high pressure sales tactic is because the agreement's written by their attorney. So it's typically written with provisions that's going to favor the solar developer, not you as the landowner. And to the extent possible, they're trying to shift risk, and we'll talk more about that risk later, but shift it away from the developer to the landowner. And an example of that, which we'll talk more about later, is decommissioning. What happens at the end of the 25 years of the useful life of the solar array? And there are some agreements where they'll say, and Kelly and I have reviewed a number of these agreements or have seen a number of these agreements, we'll say, well, at the end of 25 years, you, the landowner, will have ownership. And won't that be a great deal for you? And what they're doing is they're putting the risk of decommissioning off on you because, among other things, solar panels tend to degrade at 3% a year. And technology is changing very rapidly. So who knows what that value will be in 25 years. So it's, again, we're not saying you shouldn't agree to that. We're just saying go into this with your eyes open. Next is agreements are often long and relatively complicated. Again, the solar developer's attorney wrote the agreement, and that's why you want to consult with knowledgeable legal counsel, because your attorney, especially if they're knowledgeable in contracts, are going to know what various provisions mean and which ones then you should negotiate with the solar developer so that you're not suddenly having a whole bunch of risks shifted to you, or there's a whole bunch of ambiguity in that agreement that's going to be held against you. So you want to make sure that you meet with your competent, knowledgeable legal counsel. Before entering into negotiating with the solar developer, you do need to think about some things like what is the short and long-term use of farmland? And this could be if you've got a generational change coming up. There were things that my father wanted to do on the farm that I didn't necessarily agree with. I wanted to do it differently once I took over. And my twin sister is a cranberry grower. So it's the same thing in her family. And so you need to think about not only what's going to happen now, but what's going to happen in the longer term. And so, for example, if you're going to look at leasing land at some of the best land that you have, some of your best quality farmland, what impact is that going to have on the next generation and the farming operation and the economic feasibility of that? It could matter too where roads are currently located on your farm and where they're likely to be located. And if you've got an important road that's on land that you're going to lease away, you've got to make sure that you retain the ability to use that farm road. And it's, again, not just farm roads now, but farm roads that you think you may need to use in the future. And you also want to take a look at, is there land that could be leased that would impact your farming operations to a lesser level? The solar developer is going to come in and say, we want that parcel right there. But it's very possible that they'll accept an alternate parcel that's nearby, that's also free of trees, that's flat, that has all the same considerations. It's just not the one right next to the road, but you want to keep the one next to the road for whatever reason. I've already said this, but I'm going to put an exclamation point on this. You need to learn about the key agreement provisions prior to negotiating. Now, some of the publications we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, we have raised those questions. And so if you go through those, you should be pretty well prepared to enter into negotiations with the solar developer. Bottom line, you want to go into the negotiation process with your eyes open. And as Upper Midwesterners, and I'm going to say this from my consumer protection background, we are the part of the country, a part of the United States where we trust people more than anywhere else in the country. And unfortunately, and I'm not trying to make negative comments about solar developers at all, but we do tend to trust people, and we tend to do things on a handshake basis. Now, these are obviously written agreements. And if someone tells us that a provision means something, we're tending to believe them. And in this case, because you're looking at a long-term lease, money's involved, you want to, once again, have an attorney review this. And as we'll talk about later, in many cases, the solar developer will pay for that attorney fee and allow you to pick the attorney of your own choosing. So moving on, Kelly's now going to talk about property tax considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll give Bill's voice a break a little bit. As we're moving into this next section, we're going to talk about what are some of those more specific provisions that you might be negotiating. You know, Bill talked a lot about we can't just rely on that handshake agreement. We actually have to ask all of these questions, and the key part is get it in writing, right? Once we have a written agreement, what we talked about usually doesn't matter. There's usually a provision in there called a merger agreement or an entire agreement clause, which says this written document is the only thing that counts. So the conversation we had yesterday, the conversation we're going to have tomorrow, they don't play into this. It's what's in writing. So one of the questions as we start looking at what's in writing that often comes up is a question about property taxes. If you have farmland or land that's classified as ag use land here in Wisconsin, you probably know that you have a somewhat favorable property tax rate right now. So if we look at my house on the edge of town, might be several $1,000s for a third of an acre, as opposed to a 40-acre piece of land that's farmland might just be a couple $100s, right? That's something that the state decided was important to them to make sure that property taxes were not a deterrent from being able to farm the land here in Wisconsin. When we start changing what that land is being used for from agriculture to something else, right? We don't know necessarily always what we're going to classify solar as, and it might depend on who actually owns that solar facility. But we're probably changing away from agricultural use. And when that happens, it's going to trigger a couple of things. The property tax is likely going to change, as well as because we're probably changing the classification, we might have what's called a conversion fee, which is kind of like a penalty for making that change. Now, what you are going to want to find out and know and think about in your agreement is who is going to pay the property taxes. So if you as a landowner have been farming this land and it's in ag use value and the solar developer is coming in with an intention to change it, odds are you might want that solar developer being the one who's responsible for paying the property taxes and that conversion fee, because again, they're the one who are triggering the changes. Now, there is a little bit different, as we said, a little bit of a difference depending on who the owner of that solar developer is. Because if that solar energy system is classified as a utility, then that solar developer is or should be paying the property taxes, which is likely going to be a payment based on gross operating revenues from the prior year. But if the landowner and that solar developer are not a utility, then what we're looking at is going to be a local assessor's decision. We've worked with Wisconsin Department of Revenue to ask for guidance on this a couple of different times, and great folks to work with, nothing against the Department of Revenue. But we haven't gotten a super clear answer yet. And so what we have done is done just a spot check of different solar arrays around the state. And what we are seeing is that different municipalities, different counties are treating these somewhat differently. Again, if it's a utility, that might be going to zero on a property tax basis because the utility is handling it elsewhere. Some stayed within ag use value idea, how long that may or may not hold. Others may be being taxed based on that new value. So what you want to do if you are a landowner is probably think about how do I talked about to the solar developer who's actually making this change. There are still also some additional questions around if we did something like, say, having sheep or goats grazing underneath, or we were doing some ag research underneath the panels, would that be enough to classify it as agricultural use? Again, that's a conversation you're going to want to have with your attorney or your accountant about what the tax implications are. But one of the best things that you can do if you're trying to protect yourself in a contract situation is contract away that risk, right? Make it someone else's problem. I will hand it back over to Bill to chat a little bit about more lease considerations.
And so one of them is farmland preservation. And farmland preservation, if you're under a contract, if you own land that's under a contract with the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, another risk is that you could potentially be required to pay a conversion fee. And so you want to check with the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. We list the contact information there so that you know this up front. And you'll want to do this actually before you sign a contract with the solar developer. I highly recommend, if you're interested in doing this, to contact DATCAP very quickly and get this question answered. What are the implications if a solar array goes on a certain portion of my land that's currently enrolled in the DATCP Farmland Preservation Program?
And Bill, I'll jump in and mention too, that's also a good reminder to think as well about if you're in USDA's CRP program, Conservation Reserve Program, whether it's a state program or a federal program. If you have that land enrolled, or if you think you might have that land enrolled or want to enroll it in the future, you'll want to have that conversation before you sign on the dotted line.
Because if you do have land in CRP, that is a contract with the federal government. And the federal government may not be particularly happy to see you contract with someone else for the use of that same land that's under contract with them. And so again, you want to check all these things out in advance, and that's why we're talking about these today. Kelly's going to talk about agreement term, termination, and confidentiality next.
Absolutely. So Bill sort of set us up for this one earlier in the presentation. What we're going to talk about is how long do these agreements last, and what does that really look like during the buildup and during the operational periods. So typically what we have been seeing when we see these agreements is an operating term of about 20 years. Now that might include some renewal periods. So it might be 20 years with an option to extend for an additional 5, 10, 20, or so on. It may be broken down into stages. So for example, Bill mentioned, typically what we're going to see is an initial stage called something like development or due diligence. And that might be a year or two of the contract where that solar developer is just trying to figure out, are they actually going to develop this particular property? So they might be coming out and taking soil samples, testing to see what the solar exposure is, just locking that land up while they wait to see if neighbors are going to sign up or not. That's typically what's happening during this development or due diligence stage. We talked about that $500 to $2,500 ranges for payments. But one thing to note is that during these initial stages, those payments might be a little bit on the lower side. Usually that higher number is once it's actually operational. So it might be a year or two of development at a lower rate. Maybe we're talking a couple $100 an acre. Maybe we are talking up to that $500 an acre. Alternatively, then we're going to jump into, if they decide to move forward, a construction period. Again, typically what we've seen is that they expect this to last anywhere from 1 to 3 years of actually doing construction. So again, you might jump into a little bit higher payment rate here because they've fully committed, they're starting to alter that property, and they're locked in on it. Once we actually get into operations, or the solar facility is actually starting to generate power, that's usually when we see the switch to that full payment amount. So whether that's $500 or $2,500 per acre. When you're looking at this, one of the things your attorney will be looking for is what triggers the change? How do I know when we've actually moved from one to the other? And then how do I know after, say, that 20-year operational period is up, what's going to happen next? Sometimes these are automatic renewals unless they've given prior notice. Sometimes it's what we would call a unilateral renewal, where the solar developer gets to say, yes, I think I want to continue, and landowner, you've already locked in and signed that right away. So you're not necessarily able to change your mind. So although these terms are typically about 20 years, you're going to see a couple of different stages, and you're likely to have some renewal terms on there as well. One question you're really going to want to ask is, can the agreement be terminated before it actually expires? So in many instances, it is very, very challenging for landowners to come back and say, hey, I've decided I don't want to do this anymore. We're 6 years in or 2 years in, and to try to walk away. That could leave a landowner liable for damages to that person that they contracted with and now are backing out of it with. However, there may be certain scenarios that do trigger a termination. You just want to be sure you understand what those are. From the solar developer's perspective, one piece that is often included is that they often have the right to terminate as to a portion of the land prior to that expiration, basically at any point they want. So for example, maybe you sign up a 40-acre parcel and so does the neighbor. So we've got 80 acres together. And the solar developer decides, I want to use the neighbor's 40 and I only actually need about 10 acres of yours. They could choose to terminate as to the other 30 acres if that provision is included in the agreement. They might say, I only need the 10, that's all I want. So again, just something to look out for, something that we've been seeing regularly in these agreements. We also touched on a little bit earlier this word called decommissioning. So what happens when the lease actually does end? So I know we're imagining 20, 30, 40 years in the future, but certainly older you or your children or your heirs are going to want to know what the answer to this question is. So Bill touched on these panels are going to be changing. The technology, I don't want to say quality, but how well they're operating and producing, we know how quickly things change. So is there any remaining value to that landowner if the agreement is, hey, we're going to leave it here for you? If they're saying, okay, at the end of 20 or 30 years, it's yours, you're going to want to think about a few more questions. So number one, what would it actually cost me to clean this up and recycle this material? What would I have to pay to remove it? Do I even know what's below the ground or above the ground? Do I have information on what brand the panels are, what they're supposed to produce? Would I know who to call if there were an issue with them? Would I know if I were trying to take the base out? Do I know how deep the cement is? Do I know how deep a pylon is? Those might be questions you want to get answers to up front, because in 30 or 40 years, they may not be around to dig out the plans and share them with you. Now, the flip side is if they're saying they're going to decommission, you may not need as much access to that information. Again, completely up to you to decide that. But you do want to make sure you know who is paying for decommissioning and how long do they have to do that. So for example, if they're saying we're going to clean up and decommission within 1 year, is that 1 year period included in the operation period that you're being paid for? Or is that an additional year that you're not getting paid for while they clean up? What happens if that solar developer sells the business to someone else or they go bankrupt? What do the financials look like? Is there any type of insurance or a bond required by local government that actually ensures the money is going to be there? I know it probably sounds like I've got storm clouds and thunder clouds above my head. And the key here is just these are questions to ask, right? All we're looking to do is identify where there could be risk so that you can make sure to get the information you need to make an informed decision. You might also think about another type of guarantee, which would be like an escrow account established for land restoration. So there's a couple of different ways to ensure that money is going to be there to clean up. You just want to understand what the risks are and which one you might be most comfortable with, and your attorney can help you with that. I'm going to touch just briefly on confidentiality because Bill is going to chat a little bit later about NDAs or non-disclosure agreements, but many of these agreements do include a confidentiality clause, which essentially says that you're not going to be sharing information about the lease or the negotiations with other individuals. What you do want to keep in mind, this does not restrict you from talking to folks like your attorney, your banker, your accountant, those advisors that you need information from in order to make a decision. They're typically excluded from these, and you certainly should make sure they are before you sign it. But you also want to understand that it's not going to necessarily be applicable until you sign it. But once you do sign on that dotted line, there may be penalties for violating it. Again, I won't go too far into that because Bill's going to touch a little bit more on non-disclosure agreements later in the presentation.
Yeah, I'll just note, Kelly, that you and I have been in that uncomfortable position of doing these presentations in earlier years. And people will come up to us with signed agreements, and we can't see that they're actually signed. And they'll say, "Hey, I'd like you to tell me what this provision means." And the first question we have to ask is this a signed agreement? And does it have a non-disclosure provision to it? Because if it does, we're probably not a party you can disclose this to. And so we can't be your attorney, first of all, but secondly, we can't even give you education and training on it because we shouldn't be looking at your agreement. So it does make it a little bit awkward. And just one other point before we get on to the next slide that Kelly will be presenting on payment is that the Public Service Commission typically requires a solar developer to lease land that's going to be used for the solar array plus 20%. And so there's a requirement to go above. So they get 120% of the land signed up in leases as they're going through the approval process at the Public Service Commission, which means that if you're in that extra 20%, that you may only get a payment for the initial expiration period, but there might not actually be any solar array put on your land, and there might not actually be any energy generated, so you won't have an income stream. So one of the questions you want to ask is, what happens if you don't choose my land that you're now leasing for your actual solar array construction? And make sure that you have that tied up as well.
Yeah, and Bill, that's a great point too. As we're getting a couple of years into these solar conversations, there may be folks already that have, I'll say, sort of run out their 1 to 3 year term for development or due diligence, and that the company has decided not to move forward. These are situations where you may want to see if they either have terminated or have a right to terminate. And if you need to get a signature to have any recorded restriction on your land removed. Because if they did opt not to move forward with you and your contract did provide for termination, we want to make sure that while they're here and around, we get that signature to clear the land so that you can continue to do whatever it is you decide to do with that property in the future. So I know the next place that we're moving is on payment terms and insurance. We did talk a little bit about this. The primary option that we typically see is this concept of a base payment on a number of leased acres. So again, sort of that $500 to $2,500 per acre basis. A few pieces to watch with this, as I mentioned, thinking about, can they terminate to certain parcels that they're not going to use, and therefore it's not generating the income you originally thought it might. But also, how are they going to calculate the acreage that they are using? So you may see solar facilities that have fences put up around them in order to keep folks out so that they don't get hurt and the panels don't get hurt. But in that instance, are we just calculating within the fence? Are we calculating the fence plus a space around it? What is actually required to be part of that paid acreage, as opposed to what can you actually use? Now, when we talk about this, part of the reason we always want to be thoughtful about this is, let's say, for example, that you have, you've got a 40-acre piece of land and we've put a solar array on a portion of it, but they decide, hey, there's a strip of land on the west side that I actually am not interested in, so we're not going to use that. Well, let's say it's only 5 feet wide. You might say, well, this is silly. I can't really do anything else with that. What do you mean you're going to terminate as to that extra 5 feet? And I'm giving an extreme example. This isn't something that I've seen happen per se, but an extreme example of what could. We just want to be thoughtful about if they are terminating to something and leaving me with a piece of property that I don't feel like I can really do anything with. How do we know if that was or was not included? Again, we want to try to negotiate that up front. Like Bill said, these agreements are written in their favor. Just typically how contracts work. If I'm going to lease my property to Bill, I'm going to draft that lease in my favor, and it's going to be on him to push back and say, hey, I want something that's a little bit more fair, a little bit more middle ground. And so the same is true here, where if you're the landowner negotiating with the developer, you just want to be thoughtful about how this could be used. Now that's thinking about, again, this base payment, dollars per acre. There are a couple of other options. I've typically seen these more in other states. Bill can maybe mention if he's seen any in our state yet, but I have not. But there are some developers that were tying lease payments to power production. So essentially what that facility is going to produce. or tying those payments to a base rent plus a percentage of generated income. There are different schools of thought on this, right? So it's kind of like sharecropping or crop sharing, as we would call it for leasing, the concept of you're in for some of the risk, right? If it does really well, maybe you're going to do better than what that flat payment is. If it doesn't do so well, well, then maybe you're not getting quite as much. That can be appealing, but without knowing exactly what a facility is going to produce, it also carries a little bit more risk, especially as you probably don't have any way to influence what that payment is going to be. So if you are getting an offer like that, you might ask to see what other facilities have produced or what that rate is. You might ask for a switch to a base payment. You might say, hey, I think I've really got a beautiful sunny spot up on the top of the hill and we're gonna get after it here. I want to take the risk. That's completely up to you, but just know that there are options as they structure these payments. We did talk about the payments typically are going to be 3 big payment phases, that development stage, construction phase, and operations. But again, you may be getting paid monthly, quarterly, annually. You'll want to keep track of what that contract says. How often are you going to get that payment? And then also thinking about, is there a due diligence period even before development when payments are not being made? Is this a true lease or is this an option to lease where they have a chance to evaluate it first before they even decide to sign that final document? And then what happens if the project isn't started right away or is delayed? Are they going to give you notice of some sort? Or how long is the payment going to be stuck in a certain stage? When we talk about this, I do also caution folks to think about, what actually is going to happen between development and construction, and how long do I have between each one? We talk about the length the phases have the option to be, but there's also this concept called notice in between. So you might be in the development stage and the solar developer is doing some initial testing, but they decide, you know what, we are ready to move forward. We're going to go for it. How much time do they have to give you? How much notice that they're going to move into that next stage? And the reason this can be important is especially if you're farming this land. So let's say that they are only required to give you 30 days notice. Well, let's think about today. It's July 10th. If I'm farming a piece of property today, I probably already have tillage done. I have planting done. I've maybe done some fertilizing, some crop protecting, whether that's spraying, whether that's weeding. I've got some significant time and investment in this crop. Well, 30 days from now is August. My corn isn't going to be ready. My soybeans, whatever it might be that you've got on there. So in 30 days, if you're going to start construction, how am I getting my money back out of my crop? Are you going to be paying me any type of crop damage payments for whatever you might destroy while you're moving into construction or while you're in doing development and due diligence? How are we going to decide how much damage there was and how to pay me? I always default to, how do I figure out 3 basic things, right? Acreage, yield, and payment. So what would I have made off of this parcel or off of this damaged space had it not been damaged? And then how do I try to get paid for that? Again, these are things you want to negotiate into the contract up front, not wait until the moment that they happen. As you're thinking about this, we talked a little bit about, are you getting that variable percentage? Are you getting a certain base payment per acre? Are you getting paid monthly, quarterly, annually? And what does that mean for your farm budget or your personal budget? You always want to run those cash flow projections to figure out what it is that you're comfortable with. And again, of course, think about the liability insurance that goes along with this. So if that liability insurance premium is being paid by the developer, you may also be asked to carry some liability insurance. Typically it is both sides, but both sides may ask the other to be included as an additional insured on those policies, so that if something would happen, again, you have this insurance policy that's going to protect both sides. You might want to get a copy of that certificate of insurance or of a declaration sheet proving that that policy is actually in place. But again, keep in mind, they may also be asking you to provide the same thing in return.
And just to give you a little example, because I've had this question, what happens if the solar developer is building the array on my property and one of their trucks damages some of my farm equipment? That would be an example where you want to make sure, because of their negligence, that you have liability insurance protection under their insurance contract. Okay, we'll move on to signing bonus and attorney's fees. And I've already talked a fair amount about this, and so I won't spend too much time on this, but oftentimes the solar developer will offer a signing bonus. And there's a difference in how it's offered. As I said earlier, if they're asking you to sign within minutes, basically, we're here on your farm, we want you to sign now that we've explained this agreement to you. Watch out, that is your time to probably say, well, thank you very much for coming in and visiting with me, and then sending them on their way. But if they give you a reasonable amount of time to have you and your attorney review the agreement, that is very, very different. And so you want to, again, you just want to make sure that you have enough time to review the terms of the agreement with your attorney, and that there's sufficient time to negotiate with this and negotiate the agreement with the other side. If there's undue pressure, again, just walk away. The offer may be extremely tempting, but if they're using that kind of sales tactic, I can almost guarantee you're going to have a problem down the line, just based on all my prior work at Consumer Protection. Also, as I mentioned briefly, you can ask the solar developer to pay for an attorney to review your agreement. And as part of that, you should incorporate that into the agreement at some point. But the attorney may say, yes, we'll give you an advance, basically, to go see the attorney of your choosing. And you want to make sure it's an attorney of your own choosing. Again, competent legal counsel. And I know that Jesse put in the Farm Bureau list. There are certainly other attorneys out there as well, but that would be a good place to start.
And Bill, probably worth mentioning too, that sometimes they also will offer to pay for your attorney, but may not pay for it up front. And so you may have to submit your bills or sort of receipts to them after, and again, this can be contingent, after you've actually signed the agreement. So they may be offering attorney's fees in that agreement, but that agreement is only binding once it's signed. So if you spend dollars on an attorney to have it reviewed and ultimately decide not to sign, you may still be on the hook for those. So again, the key here is you can ask for different things. You can negotiate and say, here's what I need from you up front, solar developer, for me to move forward with negotiating this. They might say no, but you can ask.
Right. And it's oftentimes what they'll do is they'll put a limit on the amount that they're willing to pay in attorney's fees as well. But as Kelly said, you do bear a little bit of risk that if your attorney says you shouldn't proceed, they may not then have a contractual obligation to pay for your attorney's fees that you just incurred. I've already mentioned a little bit about non-disclosure agreements too, but this is important. I've learned talking to a number of landowners that there's non-disclosure agreements, but they're still fairly loose in talking about what's in their agreements. And we have to warn them, look, you agreed to this and you're not supposed to be talking to third parties about it and disclosing the terms. So why would there be a non-disclosure agreement? Because the solar developer, for the most part, doesn't want you to engage in price discovery. And what does that mean? They don't want you to be able to go to your neighbors who might also have a solar contract, find out what they're getting paid, and so that'll help determine what you're getting paid. Now, the solar developer would rather bargain off each person individually without you having knowledge of what the going rate is in that area, and that's why this happens. But once again, if you do sign the agreement, and the agreement could potentially be in advance of the actual contract, there might be a non-disclosure agreement in advance. While we're negotiating with you, you're not supposed to be talking about this with any unapproved third parties. As Kelly mentioned earlier, typically your attorney is an approved third party. Family members typically is approved third party. But realize if you're telling your family members what might be in this agreement, that they need to understand that they're also subject to this non-disclosure agreement, because if you do disclose in violation of the agreement, oftentimes there's a penalty provision, a monetary penalty provision that could get rather pricey. And so as we've said all through this presentation, go into this with your eyes open, realize what's there, what obligations you're under, and make sure you comply with those obligations. We do have a solar fact sheet. So if you're thinking about leasing land for a solar developer, this is available on the RECEP website. And we have the links right there. And I believe an electronic version of this will be sent out to all the participants. So there'll be hot links that you'll be able to use. And it goes through a lot of what we just discussed and more. And those are things that you need to think about from our perspective as attorneys before you sign on the dotted line. Then we also provide conversations with solar developers. This is a separate worksheet. And Kelly did much of the work on this worksheet. But these are the types of things that you need to not only think about, but also record as much as possible when you're having that conversation with the solar developer, so that you have that information, one, so you remember it, and two, you can convey it correctly to your attorney, so your attorney knows what was actually presented to you. Like the other document, it's available on the website, totally free of charge, and the hot links will be provided to you so you'll have ready access. There's also additional resources at this QR code. So if you have your phone out, you can take a picture of this, but also we provide the link and you can just go to the link. But there are lots of different resources on leasing land for solar, and we recommend that you take a look at it. Again, the best thing you can do is to be educated up front before you sign on that dotted line.
And Bill, it's great to mention too, we've also got a resource in the chat, go.wisc.edu/solar guide. I believe, and Jesse can probably help correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this should help take us to that reset space as well. So this larger renewable energy space. We've developed this presentation over a couple of years and these resources over a couple of years. So this link here will take you to our farm management page, but Jesse and Bill and Katie have a whole host of solar and renewable energy resources on that reset page. So I would definitely grab both if I were interested in this topic, because the one that is in the chat will lead you to a whole additional set of resources that aren't necessarily on the farm management page.
Right. Yeah, and that's our whole purpose as the University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension, is to make sure that you have the education and training to do what's in your best interest. And again, drawing on my consumer protection perspective, if one side of a contract is in the dark, they don't really understand what the contractual provisions are, what they mean, what the future implications are, that's when the chances of a disagreement go up dramatically. And you might find out that because of the contract you signed, you don't have any remedies or very limited remedies. And we just want to make sure that this is a very balanced kind of contracting, if at all possible. And then, whoops, I gotta get off something here to be able to go to the next slide. We just want to acknowledge the U.S. Department of Energy that we're able to present this based off of a grant that the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension received. And again, there's a disclaimer there on behalf of the federal government as well, that the views expressed during this webinar today do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Department of Energy or the government of the United States. And so we are duty bound to point that out as well. Now we can go to questions. And if I saw it correctly, there's a few questions in the chat. And feel free to, if you do have questions, put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them in the remaining 10 minutes.
Thank you so much,
Jesse,
Bill
I don't know
and
if you want
Kelly.
to tee those up. Yep.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, we only have a few questions right now. If people have others, please feel free to share them. So we have the question that what would you recommend to local and county officials and authorities for preparing for, I think, in general, large scale project siting? So it's a larger question than just the land leasing. But what do you think that municipalities and counties should educate themselves about, and also what their communities want?
Well, the webinar that we did earlier this week on the model solar ordinances for counties, cities, villages, and towns would be a great way to start. And that's not an ordinance that we're saying that a local unit of government would have to adopt word for word, but it gives the local unit of government a very good idea what kind of parameters are there on local government regulation. As I explained during that webinar, the state legislature, through a statute, removed a lot of the local government authority for regulating large solar developments. So what we're talking about is 100 megawatts or larger. That's all left up to the Public Service Commission with no role from the local government other than presenting the local government's views, but there's no approval process by the county, city, or village or town in that situation. For smaller projects under 100 megawatts, local units of government do retain some authority, and the model ordinance provides a roadmap that local units of government can use to retain what authorities that they have, those authorities that they want to have on behalf of their constituents. And so one of the best ways to catch up is to go back, look at that webinar, look at the model ordinance and the provisions there. Certainly, if people have questions, they can contact us here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. But that would be one of the best ways to try to catch up. There have been presentations at the various trade associations as well, the Wisconsin County Association, the Wisconsin Towns Association. So that's opportunities, and all of them have legal staff, including the League of Wisconsin Municipalities. And so they're also a resource if you happen to be a local government official. Kelly, it looked like you were going to add something.
I was trying to jump in there. Yeah, and I will keep reminding folks that this go.wisc.edu/solar guide is also going to be a great resource for all of the resources that Bill is talking about and that we've talked about today. If you click on or go to that link, that page has 4 or 5 different areas as far as the siting process, what to expect depending on the size of that solar development, local government actions. So if you are a local government official who's interested in learning more about how do they engage with the developer agreement or the ordinance, there are resources there. We do have the solar land leasing link where you'll find a lot of the materials from today's presentation, as well as a piece about large scale wind and solar impacts. Again, the work that we do here is intended to be unbiased research and data-based information. So we're trying to put this all in one easy place that you can go to as sort of a central hub to find this great information.
And I'm looking at the additional question, thinking about how landowners, local municipalities, and counties are up to speed on what communities want, what ordinances are in place, and what the state has done in preemptions. And one of the things that I recommended strongly during the earlier webinar was community development plans, local development plans, that it's a very good idea to update those plans to include provisions that address solar. Where in your community might solar be appropriate? Where are other places in the community where it might not be appropriate because it's environmentally sensitive lands or whatever it happens to be? The Public Service Commission is not obligated, particularly for the 100 megawatt or larger projects, to take that information and act on it. However, the Public Service Commission is required by statute to at least take a look at it and have that then at least have information available so that the Public Service Commission knows how the local community might be impacted, and then the PSC, if they choose to do so, can put in place regulations that will help protect those local government concerns. Don't know that I said that the best way that I could have, but hopefully it still makes sense. But that is the best way to inform the Public Service Commission where you think in your community solar might be allowed. Having said that, though, you cannot prohibit solar within your community. That the local units of government are preempted by state statute. And 66.0401 is a statutory citation if you want to take a look at that. And the legislature, through statute and executive orders by the governor, want to incentivize or want to see renewable energy projects be developed across state because there's a goal by the state to get to carbon-free energy by 2050. And one of the few ways that's going to be done is through solar and wind. Hydro is another form as well. But so there is an interest by the state to see these projects go forward. Again, local units of government, you still have some tools, and you can make yourself more knowledgeable about those tools by looking at the resources that we provided. Just looking at any other questions. I don't see any in the chat unless I missed any, Jesse.
I feel like you all did a great job covering everything, Bill and Kelly. So thank you so much for your time today and this presentation. And feel free, everyone on the call, the webinar will be available online next week. It'll be on that go.wisc.edu/solar guide. link, and we'll also be emailing it out to everyone that registered. So here's the contact information for Bill and Kelly. You're also welcome to reach out to Reset, or just please do distribute these resources to your community. Many of you probably do know landowners who are considering leasing or who have been approached. And we would love to have everyone look at this before they sign, right, Bill?
Yes, absolutely. Kelly and I are 100% in agreement on that.
100%. Oh, and so just under the wire, there's one question just hit the chat. This will be our last one for today. And the question is, what's the differences from a wind lease, if any? Can you speak to that, Bill and Kelly, now that wind projects are back in Wisconsin?
From a contractual perspective or from a local government regulation, perhaps we'll quickly deal with both.
Sure.
Kelly, why don't you do the contract and then I'll do the local government regulation side of it.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to jump in right away. And I will be honest, I haven't looked at any of the recent ones coming back in. So I might lean towards you, Bill, if you've seen some of the newer ones.
Yeah.
But typically, a lot of the same contractual provisions are going to apply. There might be differences in term or payment or structure, which in those instances, what you want to understand is exactly what they are potentially signing you up for. And that goes across the board. We want to know what the terms are going to be, what payment's going to look like. One big difference is usually around location and access. So where a solar facility is going to take up acres and acres, wind towers they're spotty, right? We don't have a field full of wind towers that we can't farm around. And so you want to be thoughtful around access to those. Where are they placed on the property? How will there be roads or driveways getting to those for folks who are performing maintenance on them? And how will they impact you in that immediate locale? Those are usually the big ones I think about, but certainly happy to have you add a few, Bill, as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. The contracts are relatively similar, have similar types of provisions with similar types of meaning. And so the same considerations that we brought out for solar, you want to think about in terms of wind. From a local government perspective, the courts have done more in the way of addressing disputes between local units of government and developers of wind. And the main case law comes actually from wind projects. The major difference is that the Public Service Commission has published a rule called PSC 128, which sets up standards for wind, and they have not done the same thing for solar. And so there's a different body of regulations that applies to wind that doesn't apply to solar. So that's the biggest difference. We're right at the end, so I can't get into further discussion here. If people are interested, again, here's our contact information, but that is the primary difference. The PSC has spent a lot more time developing regulations for wind than they have for solar.
Well, there we go. Just right on time. Hope everybody enjoyed it, got something out of it. Thank you, Katie, for sharing a list of all of the resources that were shared today during the presentation. And I hope everyone has a really good rest of the day and a great weekend.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.